Let's talk about rules everyone gets wrong, this time sequencing. Sweet, nailed it. Welcome to War Games on Toast, all of you lovely people. It's me, it's Toast. How are you this wonderful Wednesday? If I look or sound a little bit off, it's because I've been under the weather with the near fatal chest infection that's finally easing off just a smidge. And this has allowed me partial control over my vocals without sending me into a coughing fit. Sweet, nailed it. That aside, today we are going to talk about some rules. Today we are going to talk about sequencing. So that means what it is, why it's important, and more importantly, how you can get it right every single time. But before we get into all of that, please consider hitting like, leaving a comment, and subscribing, as that helps me fight against that dastardly YouTube algorithmic demon. And if you want to help the channel out in a more tangible way, then please consider joining my Patreon or my YouTube members like these amazing people on screen now. A huge shout out to the recently anointed algorithmic demon slayer, Heinz D. With all of that out of the way, let's get on with the show.
And now for something completely different.
Warcry is a game that likes to keep its nonsense tightly knit but adequately separated to allow for ease of play without distraction. In fact, the game is so good at this that there are very few instances where the game has overlap in order of operations. This is so rare, at least until very recently, that some of the best players I have had the pleasure of playing, some of the best players in the world, don't actually know what to do when the game has an overlap, at least not off the top of their head. And this is where sequencing comes into play. It's important to understand, even if it is comparatively fringe, but with the dawn of the Flame Seekers in particular, being aware of how it all works will be nothing but a boon to your play. So what is sequencing? Sequencing comes into play when two rules or abilities appear to activate simultaneously. Now, Warcry is pretty darn bap when it comes to rules. The game likes things to be done one step at a time, sequentially, and the concept of simultaneous things happening is an anathema to the core of the game. If something looks or sounds like it's happening simultaneously, it isn't. You've got to slow down your roll and do some sequencing. There are three forms of sequencing depending on what phase of the game you are in. The most common sequencing hubbub will come in the combat phase. If this happens, then you resolve it as such. The player who is currently activating a fighter chooses the order in which the rules are resolved. There is no roll-off. There is no ambiguity. If you are the one activating, you hold all the cards. I am going to bring in two examples of sequencing in the combat phase, and I am going to use Flame Seekers to do so, as they are absolutely the faction who are going to get the most use out of sequencing disputes. And of course, I am going to quickly explain how sequencing would work in both instances and why. So let's go. Ignite Weapon, boom, on screen now. This thing is one of the best doubles in the entire game. Its effect is outstanding, and if you think otherwise, you haven't been on the receiving end of the average rolling skill breaker. The effect is simple. Count one miss from the next attack action as a critical hit instead. You love to see it, but oh no, it's a reaction. A bunch of factions in Warcry have this rather powerful reaction. A fighter can make this reaction after they are targeted by a melee attack action, but before the hit rolls are made. Count up to 2 critical hits from that attack action as hits instead. So here's where things get kind of wacky in Warcry terms. Does the reaction stop Ignite Weapon from scoring a bonus crit? Sequencing kicks in, and sequencing states that the activating fighter chooses the order. Because the activating player will always be the player using Ignite Weapon, that player can force the reaction to fire first, removing any natural crits. Then once that has been resolved, they can resolve Ignite Weapon to sneak through an additional bonus crit. It's a powerful play indeed, and it's all because of sequencing. Example 2 will look at the likes of the Castellite Wall and counter. We will focus on the damage aspect of the Castellite Wall, since that is the relevant section. For each hit roll from that attack action that misses, allocate 2 damage points to the attacking fighter. Where before, sequencing allowed the igniting player to force the reacting fighter to resolve first, in this instance, that same player can force the ignite to resolve first, removing a miss from the pool and reducing the damage they take from counter. Sequencing is very powerful, and if you have control over it, you can dictate ordering in many scenarios. Thankfully, this kind of situation, outside of Flameseekers and maybe Chaos Legionnaires, is fairly rare. It's why many people don't have it committed to memory, but as the game grows, more abilities get added to the game and the different factions grow in popularity, it will become more relevant, and learning it now is only a good thing. There are two more instances of sequencing that may come into play, but I can't think of many scenarios where they would in practice. Crizzling from the Warcry Discord, however, did manage to come up with something, so let's use that example. All credit, of course, goes to him. Objective missions are typically scored at the end of the battle round. What if a rule or an effect came into play in that same slot? What if, for example, you are forced off an awakened Eldar Gnarlorc and you plummeted to your death? How would you resolve this? How would you calculate scoring or control? Would you calculate the scoring and then die, or die and then score? Sequencing works as follows in these instances. If a rule appears to fire off simultaneously in any phase other than the combat phase, then the player with initiative chooses. Again, no dice roll, no ambiguity. It's important to note here that the player with initiative and the player who activates first are not always the same thing. Be sure to keep an accurate record of who has initiative each turn, because that's just good bookkeeping. So in an instance where two rules were to pop off during the end of the battle round part of a turn, the person with initiative could, in theory, have a lot of power over the battle, as they could absolutely sequence to advantage. In our example here, forcing your model to fall to its death before they could count towards control of an objective. Finally, if sequencing comes up in any other scenario for any other reason, you just roll off. Will this ever come up? Has this ever come up? I don't know, but that's how you would deal with it if it ever does. Easy. And that's it. Pretty short video today, but I want to go over one of these smaller rules in Warcry that seems to catch a lot of people out. I play Flameseekers more than any other faction. Heck, I probably play them more than any other person on the planet. So this argument, discussion, and resolution comes up all of the time. Hopefully this video will help players improve their understanding of the game and cut through the rigmarole of having to look for a rule you might not even know existed. If you liked this video and want to see more like it, please consider hitting like, leaving a comment and subscribing. A huge shout out to my patrons and members who help keep this channel chugging along, and a massive shout out to my algorithmic demon slayers, Armor Enthusiast 7, Brioche, CT6497, Girth Demon, Head Knight of Paint, Heinz D, Kiplang, Long Run Hobbies, Lord Phylax, Tough Tootin' Baby, and Velas. Until next time, lads, ladies, and everyone in between and beyond, ta-ra. Sweet, nailed it.